are places that feel neutral, and then there are places that feel loaded. Hinterkaifeck was the second kind. A solitary farmstead in rural Bavaria, surrounded by fields, forest, and distance, the kind of place where sound travels, but help does not. About 70 kilometres north of Munich, it sat just far enough from the nearest village to be inconvenient, and just close enough to be known. It wasn't abandoned, it wasn't hidden, it wasn't forgotten, but it was separate. And on the evening of the 31st of March 1922, that separation would become fatal, because what happened at Hinterkaifeck was not sudden, it was not random, and it did not begin with murder. It began with the sense that someone else was already there. Welcome back to the Eclectic, where we examine the stories that don't sit comfortably in neat categories, where history fractures under pressure, and where certainty refuses to cooperate. Tonight's case is one of Germany's most disturbing unsolved crimes. 6 people killed, an entire household erased, a killer, or killers, who did not flee, but stayed. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, and before we talk about how they died, we need to understand how they lived. Hinterkaifeck was what Germans called an Einthof, a single isolated farmstead. One main house, outbuildings, a barn, and a yard that connected work and home into a single enclosed world. Isolation was not unusual in rural Bavaria in the early 20th century. Farms were often spread out, families were self-contained, and privacy was a necessity. But Hinterkaifeck took that separation further. The property sat at the edge of woods and fields, with long sightlines but limited oversight. Neighbours existed, but not close enough to hear raised voices, let alone screams. And crucially, the house and barn were physically connected. This meant you could move from the living space to the workspace without having to step outside. It also meant that once inside, someone could move unseen. That architectural detail matters more than it at first appears, because whoever committed these murders didn't need to break in repeatedly. They needed to access once. The people who lived at Hinterkaifeck were known in the surrounding villages, but not warmly remembered. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch. By 1922, Andreas Gruber was in his early 60s. He owned the farm and ruled it absolutely. Contemporary accounts describe him as domineering, strict, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. He was not a man who inspired affection, but he was not powerless either. The Grubers were relatively prosperous for farmers of the time. They owned land, they had livestock, and they had savings. That prosperity would later complicate theories about the motive, because wealth attracts attention, but it also attracts resentment, and Andreas had no shortage of enemies, real or imagined. Casilia Gruber, Sr., his wife. Older than Andreas, she lived the grinding, unremarkable life of a rural farm woman. Work, endurance, silence. History has left her almost invisible, recorded mostly in relation to her husband and her death. This absence is telling. When families are discussed primarily through the lens of the patriarch, it often hides internal dynamics that outsiders never see. Victoria Gabriel, their daughter. Victoria Gabriel was 35 in 1922, widowed, a mother of 2, known locally as more sociable than her parents. She sang in the church choir and moved more easily in village life. But Victoria carried a burden that followed her everywhere. She and her father had been convicted of incest years earlier. This was not a rumour, it was a matter of record. And while the legal punishment had been served, the social stain never disappeared. In small communities, memory is long and forgiveness is selective. The children. There was 7-year-old Casilia, known as Silly. She attended school in nearby Gruber. Her absence would later raise alarm. 2-year-old Joseph remained at the farm, too young to have a life beyond its boundaries, and Joseph, in particular, sat at the centre of another unresolved question. Who was his father? Rumours pointed in different directions. Some whispered that he was the result of the incestuous relationship. Others suggested he belonged to a neighbour. And when paternity is uncertain, motive multiplies. Before the night of the murders, Hinterkaifeck was already a place under quiet siege. The former maid had not left lightly. In rural Bavaria in the early 1920s, employment was scarce and reputation mattered. To abandon a position, particularly one that came with room and board, invited gossip and hardship. And yet she left anyway, telling neighbours she could no longer stay. She spoke of footsteps in the attic, of movement when no one else was home, of sounds that did not belong to the animals. When Andreas Gruber dismissed her fears, it was not unusual. Men like Andreas did not entertain talk of unease, fear was weakness, and silence was order. But the signs accumulated. A set of footprints appeared in the snow, leading from the forest to the farm. None led away. House keys went missing. A lock on the tool shed appeared tampered with. A newspaper was found in the house, one that no one in the family admitted to purchasing. In a remote farmstead, this was not a small detail. Newspapers did not arrive by accident. Someone had brought it there. Andreas noticed these things, that much is certain. But what remains baffling is what he did not do. He did not alert the police, he did not summon neighbours, and he did not sleep elsewhere or send the children away. Whether this was pride, denial, or fear of ridicule is impossible to know, but in hindsight, it reads like a man unwilling to admit that control over his domain had slipped, because control mattered at Hinterkaifeck. This was a farm ruled by authority, by an older man whose word went unquestioned, whose temper was known, and whose part had already placed the family under scrutiny. To acknowledge an intruder would have been to admit vulnerability, and as so, if someone was already there, watching, listening, learning routines, Hinterkaifeck offered them silence in return. By the time Maria Baumgartner arrived on the 31st of March 1922, the farm was not merely isolated, it was already compromised. Months before the Gruber's previous maid, Kresnariga, quit, not over wages, not over workload. She said the farm was haunted. She reported hearing footsteps in the attic, and movement when no one should have been there, sounds that made her feel watched. In a modern retelling, this detail is often brushed aside as superstition, but strip the language away, and what remains is simpler. Someone was moving about in that household, and the family did not resolve it. Instead, they hired a replacement. On the 31st of March 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck to take up her position as maid. She was 44 years old, experienced, practical. In testimony from her sister, Maria is described as having mental and physical disabilities, including a pronounced limp because one leg was shorter than the other. She mentioned that Maria had recently lost her job elsewhere because the local mayor did not want a crippled person in town. Franziska accompanied Maria to the farm that day, a small, ordinary act that would later become unbearable in hindsight. After settling Maria in, Franziska decided to leave. As she did so, Maria called out to her again as she was walking away, almost as if she were hesitant or unsettled. This would be the last time Franziska saw her sister alive. Maria had no idea she would not survive the night. I think this detail matters a lot because Maria had no history with the family. There were no grudges, no secrets, and no reason to be targeted. Her death suggests one thing quite clearly. Whoever killed the Grubers was willing to kill anyone who happened to be there. In the weeks leading up to the murders, strange things happened at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas Gruber spoke of them. Footsteps in the attic, a newspaper appearing in the house that no one had bought, keys had gone missing, and there were signs of tampering with locks. And then the footprints. A single set of tracks leading from the forest to the farm, with no corresponding trail. This detail is probably one of the most chilling in the entire case. And it's because it implies not just intrusion, but arrival. Someone came to the farm and stayed. Andreas mentioned these things to the neighbours, but he did not involve the police. Why? The possibilities could range from, obviously, pride, to fear, to familiarity, because there is a crucial difference between something strange is happening and I think I know who it is. Andreas suspected a known person, a neighbour, a former worker, someone with access. Going to the authorities might have escalated a conflict he believed he could control. That belief would cost him everything. By the end of March in 1922, Hinterkaifeck, as we have said, was not a secure place. The family lived with the sense of intrusion and continued as normal. Animals were fed, work continued, and Maria Baumgartner arrived. But the boundaries were already breached. The house was no longer private, the barn was no longer neutral, and the attic was no longer empty. Whatever happened next did not come out of nowhere. It emerged from a situation that had been deteriorating quietly, steadily, and fatally. And on the evening of Friday, 31st of March, the farm went silent. Not immediately, not all at once, but deliberately. And by the end of March 1922, Hinterkaifeck was no longer a secure place, not because violence had already occurred, but because certainty had eroded. The family continued their routines inside a space that no longer felt closed. Work went on, animals were fed. Life outwardly appeared intact, but the boundaries were gone. Someone may have been moving above their heads, someone may have had access to their keys, someone may have already crossed the threshold, not once, but repeatedly, without challenge. Hinterkaifeck was not a house waiting for a crime. It was a house already opened, and when night came on the 31st of March 1922, whatever had been watching no longer needed to hide. Before the first blow was struck at Hinterkaifeck, the crime had already begun. Ignored warnings, unexplained presence, the decision to endure rather than confront the problem. Next, we move into the night itself. The movements, the order of death, the brutality, and the detail that turns this case from horrific to almost unbearable. Killer did not leave. They stayed. And they lived among the dead. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over places where violence has occurred. Not the silence of abandonment, not the silence of sleep, but the silence of interpretation. At Hinterkaifeck, the work stopped, the routine broke, and one by one the people inside the farm were removed from the world. What we know about that night does not come from witnesses, it comes from reconstruction, from where bodies were found, from how they were arranged, and from what didn't happen, and from what did. The murders at Hinterkaifeck did not happen all at once. This was not a frenzy, not a panicked explosion of violence. It was methodical. Sometime on the evening of the 31st of March 1922, one member of the household left the main living area and went into the barn. We don't know why. Possibilities could include noise among the animals, a routine task, or perhaps a call from someone they trusted. What matters is this. They did not go alone by chance. They went because something, or someone, drew them there. That person never came back. What happened in the barn was not chaos. It was controlled. Investigation later struggled to explain how 4 people could be killed in the same place without alarm spreading through the house. But the answer may lie in trust. One by one, members of the family appeared to have been drawn into the barn, perhaps to investigate a noise, tend to an animal, or respond to a request. This was familiar ground, safe ground, a place where no threat was expected. The weapon, a mattock belonging to the farm, which was found after the house was demolished, required proximity and strength. Each blow demanded intent. There was no sign of a struggle spilling across the yard, no frantic escape, no alarm raised. After death, the bodies were stacked, covered, concealed beneath hay and a door. This was not the act of someone fleeing in panic. It suggests someone who had time, someone who was not afraid of the discovery, and someone who expected the night and the days after to belong to them. Inside the barn, investigators would find 4 bodies. They were not scattered, they were not random, they were stacked. Andreas Gruber, Casilia Gruber, Senior, Victoria Gabriel, and 7-year-old Casilia. Each had suffered multiple blows to the head. The weapon used was a mattock, a heavy farm tool combining an axe and an adze, capable of splitting skulls with devastating efficiency. This was not improvised violence. This was an intimate familiarity with tools and force. The positioning of the bodies tells us something critical. Each member of the family appears to have been attacked individually, not as a group. One lured, killed, moved, then the next. This again highlights that fact that the killer had time, they had control, and they had no fear of interruption. Among the victims in the barn, Victoria Gabriel's injuries stand apart. In addition to the blunt force trauma, she showed signs consistent with strangulation or neck compression. The detail has haunted the case for over a century, because strangulation requires proximity, sustained pressure, and intent. It's not the act of someone rushing, and it suggests something more personal, and that raises an unavoidable question. Victoria the primary target? If so, the others may have been obstacles, removed methodically to reach her, or worse, witnesses eliminated one by one. 7-year-old Casilia, Silly. She suffered injuries so severe that later examiners believe she may have lived for hours after the attack. Clumps of her own hair were found in her hands, a sign of extreme pain or fear, or both. This detail alone undermines any attempt to soften the brutality of what occurred at Hinterkaifeck. Whoever committed these murders was not disturbed by the presence of a child. They were not stopped by it, and they were not hurried. After the barn killings, the violence moved inside. Joseph, only 2 years old, he was killed in his cot with a single powerful blow. There was no struggle, no chance to cry out. This was not necessary violence, it was preventative, a decision. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, she was found in her bedroom also killed by blunt trauma to the head. Chillingly, the murderer had covered her body with her bedsheets. Maria had arrived at the farm many hours earlier. She had no history here, no role in family conflicts, and no reason to be targeted, except for one. She was present, and presence alone was enough. In many murder cases, attention focuses on what is done. At Hinterkaifeck, what wasn't done is just as revealing. The house was not ransacked. The valuables remained, money was not taken, and furniture was undisturbed. This does not mean robbery wasn't a motive, but it strongly suggests it was not the primary one, because someone who kills 6 people for theft does not usually linger. And the killer at Hinterkaifeck did linger. This is where the case crosses from horrific into profoundly unsettling. Evidence indicates that after the murders, someone remained on the farm for several days. Neighbours later reported smoke from the chimney, animals being fed, and cows being milked. Food in the kitchen was eaten. This was not survival behaviour, it was routine. Someone slept there, worked there, and moved through the house, all while 6 bodies lay dead, some of them children. This detail eliminates many explanations. A thief would flee, a panicked killer would hide, and a stranger would not risk discovery. Whoever stayed at Hinterkaifeck felt entitled to be there. This behaviour is exceptionally rare in homicide cases. Most killers would flee, they would panic, and they would distance themselves from the scene. Staying requires confidence. It requires familiarity with the property, with its rhythms, its isolation, its lack of oversight. It requires the belief that no one will arrive unannounced. To sleep, cook, and work in a place where 6 people lie dead, including a child in a crib, demands either profound detachment or a sense of ownership. Hinterkaifeck was not treated like a crime scene. It was treated like a home. By the 4th of April 1922, concern turned into action. The family had not appeared at church. Silly had missed school, and no one had been seen working the fields. Neighbours went to the farm. Among them was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. What happened next would shape the investigation and controversy forever. Schlittenbauer entered the barn. He moved bodies. He entered the house alone. He handled the victims with bare hands. Some interpreted this as shock, others as familiarity. Still, others would later say it looked like certainty. Certainty that the killer was gone, or certainty that there was nothing left to hide. The crime scene at Hinterkaifeck was compromised almost immediately. Neighbours walked through the farm. Curiosity seekers touched evidence, and children wandered in and out. The bodies were moved again for examination, not in a morgue, but in a local inn. Even by the standards of 1922, this was catastrophic. Vital details were lost, positions altered, context erased, and with it, the possibility of certainty. By the time the authorities understood what they were dealing with at Hinterkaifeck, this was no longer a crime scene. It was a rumour mill, a spectacle, a place already slipping into legend. 6 people were dead. The killer had lived among them afterward, and the investigation had begun with its most important evidence already contaminated. We turn now to what followed. The suspects, the accusations, the theories that refuse to die, and the uncomfortable truth that emerges when none of them quite fit. Because Hinterkaifeck is not just unsolved, it is unresolved. Every unresolved case has a question that refuses to fade. At Hinterkaifeck, it wasn't who killed the family. It's this. Who stayed? Because whoever committed the murders did not flee into the night. They remained. They fed animals. They lit fires. They slept beneath the same roof as the dead. That single fact narrows the field and widens the unease. No name is more tightly bound to Hinterkaifeck than Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He lived nearby, he knew the family, and he had history with Victoria Gabriel. At various times, Schlittenbauer acknowledged, and then denied, that he was the father of little Joseph. He disputed maintenance payments, he clashed openly with Andreas Gruber. These tensions were public, bitter, and unresolved. When the family failed to appear, it was Schlittenbauer who helped organise the search. And when the bodies were found, it was Schlittenbauer who entered the house alone, who moved the bodies, and unlocked doors others believed to be locked. Some saw this as bravery, others as shock, but some saw something else, familiarity. He behaved like a man who already knew what he would find, yet suspicion is not proof. Schlittenbauer was questioned repeatedly. He was investigated. He was even sued for slander when accused. And nothing conclusively tied him to the murders. If he was guilty, he was extraordinarily fortunate. If he was innocent, he lived the rest of his life under a shadow. The temptation in cases like Hinterkaifeck is to want one name, one explanation, one narrative. But the evidence resists that simplicity. Schlittenbauer had motive, perhaps, but motive does not explain the pre-murder footprints, the attic noises, the missing keys, the calm occupation of the farm afterward. Those details suggest preparation, present. Someone who was already there. Other suspects emerged, former workers, petty criminals, men who knew the land. Names like Anton and Karl Bischler, George Segal, the Thaler brothers. These men had criminal histories. Some had knowledge of the farm's layouts. One former maid suggested that Segal had previously stolen from the Grubers. The theory was straightforward: a robbery, interrupted, turned violent. But the facts don't cooperate. If this was robbery, why was the money left behind? Why stay for days afterwards? Why tend to the animal? And why conceal bodies instead of fleeing? The behaviour does not align with desperation or greed. It aligns with something slower, more deliberate. Some have speculated about distant relatives, others about long simmering feuds. Andreas Gruber was not liked. He was domineering, harsh. His incest conviction marked the family socially. But again, motive alone collapses under logistics. A revenge killing does not usually involve methodical luring, staged concealment, and extended occupation. And no missing relative or aggrieved acquaintance ever surface with the means or opportunity. One of the most controversial theories proposes a travelling murderer, a man sometimes identified as Paul Müller. The theory links Hinterkaifeck to a broader pattern of axe murders across Europe and the United States, including the infamous Vizsla killings. The similarities are chilling. Isolated rural homes, entire families, blunt force trauma, and nighttime attacks. But similarity is not identity. There is no evidence placing Müller in Bavaria in 1922. No witness, no document, no trace. It remains a hypothesis, compelling but speculative. When modern investigators re-examined the case in the 1950s and again in 2007, one factor outweighed all others. The killer stayed, not briefly, not accidentally, but comfortably. Again, this suggested to them that the killer had familiarity with the farm routines, confidence that no one would interrupt, and psychological detachment from the victims. This wasn't panic, it was possession, and that narrows the likely profile dramatically. The 1922 investigation was doomed early on. The crime scene was destroyed, evidence was handled improperly, and records were lost or later destroyed. By the time the case was reviewed post-war, witnesses were dead, memories were unreliable, and politics hovered in the background. In the 1950s, police reportedly had a prime suspect. That name was never recorded. Officially, the suspect was dead. Unofficially, the silence speaks volumes. Modern criminal profiling tends to converge on a chilling conclusion. The killer was likely male, familiar with the farm, physically capable, emotionally detached, comfortable with sustained violence. Not a stranger passing through, and not a panicked thief, but someone who felt a sense of entitlement to the space. Someone who had already crossed moral boundaries long before that night. Hinterkaifeck endures because it resists closure, because every theory explains some facts and contradicts others, because the most disturbing element is not the violence itself, it is the normality afterward. The cow still needed milking, the fire still needed tending. Life, for the killer, went on. Hinterkaifeck was demolished in 1923. The land was ploughed, the buildings erased. A small memorial now marks the place, but nothing was solved. 6 people died, a killer lived among them afterward, and history never caught up. Perhaps that is the final horror of Hinterkaifeck. Not that violence occurred, but that it fits so easily into routine. That someone could kill a family, then stay, then leave, and never be named. The reason Hinterkaifeck still unsettles is not just that it remains unsolved, it is that every explanation feels incomplete. The evidence is fragmentary, the files are damaged, witnesses are long dead. Every suspect fits and doesn't. And so the case resists closure, not because it lacks answers, but because it exposes limits. Limits of investigation, limits of memory, limits of certainty. Hinterkaifeck remains a place where something terrible happened, and the truth was never fully recovered. That absence lingers. This has been The Eclectic, a story not just about murder, but about silence, and the spaces where answers should be. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.